All right, so thank you so much for joining us today. We're obviously pleased to be joined by Mr. Martin Griffiths, who is here for his last press briefing to you all in New York in his capacity as the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the Emergency Relief Coordinator. He'll make some opening remarks and then take some questions. So please, Mr. Griffiths.
Thanks very much, Eri. Thank you all for being here. It's been a real privilege of mine to have had... Is this not working? Okay, sorry. I'll start again. Okay. It's a real privilege for me to have been in the job that I will be leaving at the end of June as the head of OCHA, the Humanitarian Undersecretary General in this building, at a time when the world has managed to make us all realize, with your help, how central that service for the people who need us is. So it's been a great privilege, and I shall be leaving with some important pieces of wisdom, I hope, for my future life. It's also been a privilege to be working with you, and I hope also that that will continue in one form or another as we go further. I want to make, the usual 3 or 4 points and then stop. First of all, we're now, I think, looking at around 300 million people around the world needing humanitarian assistance. And we have approached that figure in terms of planning for 2024 with a lot of rigor. We've worked very hard collectively, the humanitarian community, in offices around the world in all the countries where these people live, to make sure that the plans that we put forward are really prioritized, are really about life-saving. We have done this partly because we know that money is more restricted, more limited. We brought the ask down from about $59 billion last year to $49 billion this year. It's a stress-tested set of plans. And as you know, it's based on humanitarian response plans which are in countries or in regions where conflict and indeed climate as a rapidly increasing driver of humanitarian need is present as a problem, as a set of problems. So 300 million people in need. Our plans aim to reach about 188 million of those of the larger figure. We have to date, the middle of the year, received $8 billion. So we have 17% funded of our programs around the world. And I'm constantly coming across, and I have all the figures here, places where, no, we've got 6%, Syria, maybe 15%, Sudan. Halfway through the year, it's never been quite as difficult and as bad as it is now. So that's my first point. My second point is that it's a set of crises which occupies all your attention and all my attention, and reduces the bandwidth available for discussion of those crises which are not topping the agenda, topping the news cycles, topping our agenda, topping the agenda of donors and those involved in my community. I started work in OCHA, was immediately sent to Ethiopia. Tigray was the crisis of the day at that time in mid-2021. Tigray, where even now the figures of those who died in that operation are unclear, but are massive. There are estimates of more than 200,000. Tigray was a terrible, terrible time, and we haven't talked about it recently, and yet there is speculation about famine there again. Certainly we have seen a lot of movement back, people displaced, trying to go home, not easy, in a situation of continuing unease and instability. Tigray was taken over in my life and yours by Afghanistan. Taliban walked into power in August and September of 2021, and I remember particularly, as I'm sure you do, that while that was happening, there was a massive earthquake in Haiti which barely made the news, even though it was a horrendous event in our hemisphere. Afghanistan, I was lucky. I went on behalf of the Secretary General to Kabul to greet the new rulers. I had spent a lifetime working in Afghanistan one way or another. And we had some hopes then. We had indeed some written commitments then as to how we would be able to go forward with the Taliban. And those hopes have been dashed. The edicts against women and girls have come one after the other. And the degree to which and the issues upon which the international community engages with the Taliban on behalf of the people of Afghanistan is still a conversation. That was then superseded, of course, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, February 2023, and 2022, and all that told us about disaster and needs and displacement and trafficking and sexual abuse and crisis and the destruction of systems which have protected people for generations and is not over yet, as we know. And that was then superseded by Gaza and Sudan. And as we speak today, and I'm happy to talk to some of those issues in more detail, the limits of our attention are to these big crises: Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, whereas Syria, Yemen, Haiti are places still of great suffering. So I leave this job with a sense of work unfulfilled, because the world is a worse place now than when I joined up in 2021. I want to make one or two comments about the world. I have spent much of my life as a mediator, not just as a person involved in the humanitarian world. I have noticed in these last 3 years of being in the humanitarian world how humanitarian diplomacy has been obliged to take a front seat in the absence of much political diplomacy because of the divisions, the geopolitics that we face today. We are proud in the United Nations of the fact that we were able, using humanitarian diplomacy and mediation, to get a deal on the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the Memorandum of Understanding that the UN signed, the Secretary General signed with Rebecca Greenspan in the lead with the Russian Federation on their exports. That was a piece of diplomacy which depended on the fact that enemies could sign up on an agreement, not directly on the same page, but about an agreement, because it was for a greater good beyond it, for global food security. Humanitarian diplomacy is both an opportunity for us to do good for the world, but also, in its ubiquity, is a reminder of the absence of classic political diplomacy. In Sudan, we see the absence still of efforts to stop that conflict. We are desperately worried about Fasher, 800,000 civilians at risk there. I spoke yesterday to Ramtane Lamamra, the personal envoy of the Secretary General, who is one of the most experienced mediators in the world today, and he has some very, very clear and good plans about how to go forward. So that's, I think, inspiring. I'll leave it to him to describe them. But the humanitarian situation in Sudan has grown worse, and it is a place where two men basically decided that they were going to resolve their differences through fighting, that they were going to take the country down, that we have a situation where highly likely we will have up to 5 million Sudanese people at risk of famine when the next report comes in, which will be in the coming weeks. I don't think we've ever had that kind of number at risk of famine. And this was an avoidable conflict. And that's my double point here. We're not winning on ending conflicts. We hoped for Yemen. I hoped for Yemen. We hoped for Yemen. That's going backwards right now. but it's essentially because the attention and commitment to the use of negotiation and dialogue to end conflict is a trait, a norm, a commitment, which is now no longer an essential component in international diplomacy. The impunity that goes with the willingness of men to reach for the gun to resolve their differences has also never been so great. The protection of civilians issue in the Security Council, it was a good resolution, but God knows it's a bad world. God knows it's a bad world. Listen to Tedros on the subject of the deliberate targeting of health institutions in various places. Listen to Philippe Lazzarini on the massive numbers of his colleagues killed and who now faces the possibility of having his organization classified as terrorist. Thank you very much. So we are not resolving conflicts. We are not using dialogue where we had committed ourselves to using dialogue. And the founders of the UN, back in 1945, in those words of the Charter, saving subsequent generations from the scourge of war, we're failing them, right, left, and center. And the humanitarians, I think, are doing a great job, heroically in the field, scraping together support where they can, but they're not the saviors. The saviors of this world are people who end wars and build peace. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Edith.
Thank you very much, Martin. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing, and I know I speak for everyone in this room saying we will miss you, your voice, and your candor, and we all wish you the best in wherever your next job and life takes you. My question is about Gaza.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, we all know the situation in Gaza is dire, and especially in Rafah, it's become more dire. Is any humanitarian aid getting into the south, into Rafah and al-Muwasi? How close are you to running, and the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people there, to running out of everything? And also, this goes to central Gaza, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have fled, and if you could also say something about the famine in the north. Thank you.
Shall I answer? Yes. Gaza, by the way, just to pronounce it correctly. In fact, I had a call just now with my colleague Mohammed Hadi, the humanitarian coordinator, because I wanted to get a catch up with him about kind of the answer to your questions, Edie. What is it like? How can you plan for a humanitarian operation under the circumstances that we face? And the answer is you can't. We know what we need, and we know what we haven't got. We need fuel, and it's not being brought in great numbers. We need truckloads of food that get through. You heard about the terrible events of Saturday when a World Food Programme convoy was looted, including now trucks being taken away. Never mind the food that's on them. And it wasn't just food, it was also other nutritional items. We know that there's only one hospital left in the south, which is open, and people can't get to it. There is no safety in Gaza. 1 million people have left Rafah, just as we all said they would have to seek some kind of safety. They've gone to places like al-Muwasi, which did not have and does not have the right facilities that they need for their lives. We do not have the capacity to deliver at scale, or even not at scale, in Rafah and in the central area. We know that there is, of course, because of the insecurity, because of the fighting, fewer and fewer aid workers in those places to be able to manage distribution. We know that Rafah crossing remains closed, and the pier, I guess, is about to open. I hope so, because we need every possible help we can. Keresh Shalom, thank you very much to Egypt for agreeing, President Sisi, to push trucks from Egypt through Keresh Shalom, but Keresh Shalom, of course, prioritizes private sector trucks over humanitarian aid. So we are not facing the conditions. We are not living, and it's not us, it's the people of Gaza, are not living in the conditions that are necessary as a basis for a humanitarian operation. I think I've referred to it recently as unplannable. Now, I understand there are about 300 trucks. This is always a debate within the humanitarian community as to whether to talk about trucks or talk about conditions and so forth. But trucks is also a handy reference point. There are about 300 trucks that operate in Gaza. And that means for the private sector as well as for humanitarian aid. And that means trucks that are still hopefully in the hands of their owners as opposed to taken off by gangs, by looters and criminal enterprises. And that gives you an idea of the limits of what we could imagine if we are all, and God knows we all certainly hope so, the people of Gaza benefit from a deal to stop the fighting. We've called for a humanitarian ceasefire for months. This is not a new ask. We've called for safety and security on these routes for months. We've called for clarity about international humanitarian law, and we've called for embedding our own planners and people with the Israeli Defense Forces so that we can make sure that our movements are safe. And we've all lost, the NGOs, the UN, have all lost people as a result of the absence of those conditions. So it's, at the moment, it's a trickle, Edie, of aid, and it's subject to all those impossibilities. So what I hope will happen in the event of a deal in terms of a ceasefire, and obviously the return of the hostages as well as the release of prisoners, I hope that there will be attention given to the clarity of the things we have long since asked for. I had a very good, detailed phone call yesterday with Samantha Power, the administrator of USAID, an old friend of many of us, I'm sure, who has been a passionate advocate of humanitarian action in Gaza these many months. She knows what we need. We just need it.
Yes, Mr. Griffith. Shidoju with China Central Television. A follow-up on the situation in Gaza. Last December, you talked to media. You said it isn't really a statistically significant operation anymore in Gaza when you're talking about humanitarian operation. Now, obviously, the situation is getting worse. Is there any threshold for UN to stop the humanitarian operation if the situation continues to get worse? And how far away do you think we are now from that threshold? Thank you.
You know, it's with some pride, I must say, that I find myself associated with the humanitarian community around the world. Because the risks that those people take, I don't, look at me, you know, I'm here, but the risks they take daily are remarkable. I had a meeting here in New York last week of the heads of humanitarian agencies. We meet every 6 months in a committee that I'm responsible for. International NGOs, UN agencies, national NGOs, civil society. And we went through all the crises that, you know, we're discussing today. And they said something which I think partly answers your question, which is we've never asked so much of our people in the field to take so many risks, whether it's in Darfur, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's anywhere else. And we are asking them to do more and more and take more and more risks, and we're doing so at a time of impunity. We all know this. Look at the impunity. It's rampant. Now, What humanitarian agencies don't do is quit. They don't quit. Famously, they talk about staying and delivering. But in Gaza, staying and delivering is a promise more than a fact. Because they may stay, but delivering, as I was saying to Edie, is something which has been made almost impossible. So we won't pull out unless the security is such that it's just too dangerous to be there. I have my own colleagues in Rafah, in Gaza, up in the central area as well. They're not leaving. Gilles Michaud, the head of security for the UN, has done a huge amount of work trying to make sure that we understand the risks and understand the requirements for safety. We won't leave, but we're looking at an operation which is not delivering. We're nowhere near where we need to be. And indeed, the levels of malnutrition, sorry, and then I'll stop. The levels of malnutrition among children has risen, and the line is clear that as you do not introduce food into people's diet, they get hungry, they get malnourished, they get sick, they die. It's a line, straight line, yeah.
Thank you, Michelle Nichols from Reuters, and thank you for speaking with us regularly during your time. Just with regard to what you said about Sudan and the upcoming IPC report, you know, we've been hearing for a long time now that 5 million people are slowly stepping towards possible famine.
Yeah.
Are you sort of predicting, have you seen a drop, like, are these 5 million, are you expecting them to have tipped into IPC 5? And is that essentially, you know, arguably, that's kind of famine, right? With a bit of lack of data. If you could just explain a little bit more for our readers exactly what that means. And then I think another IPC analysis is due shortly on Gaza. Do you think it can accurately reflect the situation in Gaza, given the big movement of people within Gaza?
I think on the second, it's very difficult operating conditions, right, to get your data right. And I mean, we were talking a few weeks ago about the use of data in Gaza. It's a perilous enterprise, isn't it? Because people are busy trying to survive, as opposed to collecting data. And data on famine is essentially, as you know, data on morbidity as well as mortality. And, you know, to get reliable data in a place like Gaza, of course, is a big ask. But yes, 1.1 million people, particularly in the north. We'll see what they say in terms of whether that has become real famine. There's a huge reluctance on the part of the technical community which makes the pronouncements about, is this a famine, or is it like famine, or is it on the brink of famine, or is it looming famine? You know, all the words we've all used and heard. Is it a full-blown famine? And so forth. I think I'll come to Sudan, but I think the truth is that, but not least because of resumed hostilities in the north of Gaza, have led people to greater disease and illness and deaths and starvation and hunger. People die in famine from disease, a disease driven by hunger. And the problem with famine is it's viral. It's different from hunger, as you know. It goes like crazy. It rips through communities. And IPC 5 for me is as good as saying famine. Let's be just common sense about this. The worry that we have in Sudan is that they'll be moving up from IPC 3 and 4 and tipping into 5. And it was one of the crises we discussed at the Interagency Standing Committee last week. FAO, which of course is the host for the technical assessment on famine and hunger, was saying that they fear very much that they will tip into IPC 5 in the sort of numbers that I've been describing. And the worry is that we are not getting seeds to farmers in time for the planting. And so we'll see another harvest failure in Sudan, and with all the consequences. So access in Sudan is partly aid, but I mean aid to include seeds. And we're running out of time for that. We've only got, you know, a week, 2 weeks max to get seeds there, and we're not doing well on access in Sudan.
Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim, Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper. I want first to follow up on what you said regarding Gaza. You said we are looking at operation that is not delivering as it should. If you could tell us what do you want to see immediately happening that you can deliver? And then a broader question, looking at what happened in Gaza and the conflict and the fact that aid is not getting as it should be, do you believe that, and other conflict, do you believe that humanitarian organizations or the UN should rethink the way you deliver aid and operate in these conflicts so that you have better tools to strengthen, tools to strengthen your work? What should be done differently that Gaza doesn't become a blueprint for other conflicts? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we've been repeated, and this is not going to be news today. What do we need? We need those border crossings open. Rafah, Keres Shalom, Ashdod, delivering consistently down to the two crossing points in the north. That would be a help. Of course, we need the pier to operate as well, so we're looking forward to that restarting. But you start with the import. Can we get aid in? Can we please prioritize humanitarian aid, if you wouldn't mind, as opposed to private sector? Because the people who really need aid in Gaza don't have the money to buy on the market what's available. So please, let's have that. Number two, we need safety. The looting of the World Food Programme convoy on Saturday was a seminal event because, as I say, it didn't just loot 60 trucks or whatever it was, but it also took half of those trucks as well. And this was, I think we've been calling it self-distribution, which is an extraordinary phrase. The increase in criminality in Gaza is a direct consequence of the conflict and the fact that families aren't able to get stuff that they need for their households to survive. And so they resort to these methods. I don't even condemn it, but we observe it. We need security. You remember the first trucks that came off the maritime operation that the US and the UAE put up, they were all looted. World Central Kitchen brought truckloads in of aid weeks before from the sea. They were looted. And what we did together with the Israeli Defense Forces and the US being very, very helpful, by the way, in getting these conditions, is to find new routes which are safer. So we need safe routes, we need better access, we need then to have clarity about how aid workers who are needed to help with the distribution of aid, you can't just drop the aid and go. It needs to be distributed so that the most vulnerable get the priority, that they should be enabled to go back to their work safely. So it's not rocket science. This is something we need everywhere. We have notification systems in Syria, in Ukraine, in Gaza, you name it, but they haven't worked as they should. New tools, I would simply say that we need to have a much more aggressive approach to impunity. We cannot allow this to keep happening. Nobody has been found liable for the killing of humanitarian aid workers in Gaza. Nobody has been found liable for the attacks on health facilities in Gaza or in Ukraine or in Sudan. Impunity is, I'm sorry, no, I'll stop. On to the next one.
Thank you, Mr. Griffiths. Ahmed Fathi, ATN News. Thank you for your candid remarks and briefing you're giving us. But in spite of all these challenges, was there any lost opportunities that you see in hindsight that it was possible to do? And what would you advise your successor when you end your term, when he or she assume your position? Thank you.
Whatever nationality they may be, of course. It's an open competition. Inshallah. Yeah. Lost opportunities. That's a very good question. I personally feel that we have lost opportunities in Afghanistan. You know, one of the interesting stories about Afghanistan is that you did not see the great outflow that was predicted of people in 2021, and that was because this is not a lost opportunity. This has actually worked because there was huge efforts, including by ourselves, but ICRC, UNICEF, and others, to maintain basic services, so that people could stay and not run for the exits, and that's still the case. Because security in Afghanistan has improved, of course, under the current rule. But I think we have lost some opportunities to engage further. And I'm hopeful that Doha 3, which is coming up in a matter of weeks, will make clear the agenda for international engagement. As I say, I've worked with the Taliban for the last 25 years, and the interesting thing about Taliban is they don't change. They're the same people, actually, that I dealt with. One of my first people I dealt with the Haqqani network, I met in 1982, so somewhat before you were born. And, I wish to. But they are the same, and there is a certain way of engaging with them, taking into account, I think, the appalling edicts that they have brought to bear. But even with those edicts, we work hard, we really being frontline organizations, typically women-led, typically Afghan, to deliver aid to women and girls in Afghanistan. I've recently been reminded of this by a program of work which provides education to women and girls, 2,000 or so across Afghanistan, but very, very discreetly getting on with the job. We have not been able to craft a formula yet. I'm not blaming anybody. I think it's tough with the Taliban, but we haven't been able to craft a formula which allows us to have cross-the-board engagement. I am one of those, and OCHA is one of those, which believes that investment in and attention to the economy of Afghanistan, as Feridun, the Turkish official, reported to the Security Council, is a very important entry point. And we have been talking to the Taliban, including their leadership, about that in recent days, and I think more can be done on that. And more can be done by, coalitions of key member states to take that forward. So I think Afghanistan has been something of a missed opportunity. Yemen, of course, has. I give huge credit to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the work it did and it has done to develop that peace agreement. Hans Grunberg is an extraordinary special envoy, and now we see it at risk because of the war. I was reminded by one key ambassador here the other day. I said, what will encourage, what needs to happen to get Ansarallah to stop bombing ships in the Red Sea and another impediment to world trade? And I was told we need a ceasefire in Gaza, a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. It's as straightforward as that. Well, I hope so, because Yemen still is doable. It's on the rocks, but it's doable, I think. It's not quite a missed opportunity.
What do you advise your successor?
Yeah. I think two things. Your job, I would say to him or her or him, is going to be completely absorbed by crisis, because you will still be the front end of international response to crises, to wars, to climate, the damage of climate change. So you can be completely absorbed by that if you're not careful, because the world will expect that of you. But really, the key challenge for my successor and for the humanitarian community is nothing to do with crises. It's to do with changing the way we operate our humanitarian operations, that we shift it into gear by establishing clear and honest relations with local communities and let them tell us what they need and what they want. That we actually make a reality of the rhetoric that is often used about empowering communities that we make that the central proposition, that we make that our programming guide, that we make that the definition of what people actually need. Because, by the way, there's all the evidence you need around the world that they are much more efficient at identifying what they need, and we need efficiency. So we have a project in OCHA in 5 or 6 countries which is trying to do that, is trying to flip so that you program from the community, not from the capital. And it's already getting a huge take-up from different countries and humanitarian coordinators of different countries because it's so obviously the right thing to do. So yes to crises, but yes to reform.
Thank you, Undersecretary General, for your work, also for this briefing, and I wish you well for the future. It's Benno Schwinghammer with the German press agency. You had a pretty dark assessment, obviously. You said the world is a bad, bad place, and it's in fact worse than a few years ago. Is there anything that gives you hope that this might change?
Yes, thank you. I was talking to my colleagues, Eri here beforehand, saying, how do we end on a high note, you know, sort of the doldrums. What is very, very clear to me, and I've spoken publicly about the awful privilege of being in a job like mine, where you go to the worst places in the world in terms of suffering and tragedy, but you see there the most extraordinary humanity. And as you probably know, one of the experiences which will never leave me was in Burkina Faso, early on in the current regime, where I went there, and I went to a place called Djibo, and I wrote about it, in fact. It was a population of about 60, 70,000 people cut off from any access to food or goods by an al-Qaeda insurgency surrounding it. 300,000 people had arrived on their doorstep as displaced. No aid was going in. We had to fly in and out, and you can't do aid for those numbers by air. And that population gave everything for their new and uninvited neighbors. And the mothers in that place, once the leaves and salt had been finally all used up, that there was nothing left to eat, they would cross the lines of conflict every night to find the leaves and salt, as they put it to me, for themselves, for their families, and for their uninvited neighbors. Humanity, and there's many, many surveys about this, the UN DP Human Development Report reminds us that humanity, which is defined for me by the willingness to give to your neighbor and to be generous with what you have to enable your neighbor to have a better life, all the surveys show that hasn't changed. What has changed is a leadership which has failed in the essential compact between leaders and people, which is that our leaders are not doing what we expect of them. The people around the world, cross cultures, cross continents, haven't changed. We still expect better for our children. We still will give to our neighbors, even though we have very little. So actually, it's not a bad world. It's our world.
Mr. Griffiths has time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for doing this briefing. Two things. One is, are there the beginnings, I mean, I know it's premature, but are there beginnings of any kind of preliminary post-war discussions about what role the UN would play, what kind of security you would have in Gaza? And also, there were differences between the UN, the US, and Israel on the other side on what role the UN might play in distribution from the pier on the maritime corridor. Has that been resolved? Is UNRWA part of that? Or are they still excluded and playing a role? Thanks.
I must, on the first question, I think this is a burning issue. As you know, there's a conference to be held in Jordan next week, looking at Gaza and looking at humanitarian response. But I'm sure we'll also discuss the burden of your first question. What about the future of Gaza? If there is a future, it seems surreal right now, but we all must plan for it. Not least because the people of Gaza deserve a kind of hope, a horizon of hope. A UN role in this, I think it's clear that the UN will continue to be a central player in the provision of aid and indeed the mobilization of reconstruction assistance. It'll come, no doubt, from the region, but also elsewhere. So there will be the traditional role that indeed my office partly plays, but Sigrid Kaag as well, and the UN system and the international financial institutions will play on the aid front. And that leaves two other roles necessary for Palestine, which is governance and security. And it's not clear to me at the moment what role the UN would have in those two areas. But I can tell you what I believe to be clear. Number one, and Jean-Pierre Lacroix has said this publicly, the idea of having UN peacekeepers in Gaza is delusional. It's not going to happen. We shouldn't rely on that. We need to find other ways to provide security in Gaza. Secondly, on governance, it's clear to us, it's clear to the Secretary General, and it's been said so often, governance has to be Palestinian. It must be centered within the Palestinian Authority and their dispensation. I think and believe and hope that the UN can play a support role also to support that, whether it's in the West Bank or in Gaza. But it's to be determined, and I think it's an urgent matter to have those roles determined. I was in the Gulf region about 10 days ago and had very detailed discussions from my perspective, from the OCHA perspective on that. There's a lot to do, and I hope the UN will be asked to do a lot. I think it's a compliment if you're asked to do things like this. On the pier, yes, I was directly involved in trying to ensure that we had clarity of purpose. And under the leadership of the Secretary General, we did achieve that. And the World Food Programme, as you know, was asked on behalf of the whole of the UN system, including UNRWA, to be there on the beach to receive the aid, and then they would distribute. They did, when it was working, take that aid to UNRWA warehouses, and UNRWA was the follow-on distributor. So we achieved what I think we needed to achieve. It took us a bit longer than it might have done, but it was all on the basis of risk. And we worried quite a lot, and Gilles Michaud was directly involved in the negotiations about the risk to our own staff and even to Palestinian contractors by being on the beach near Israeli Defense Forces or others. And Gilles came up eventually after a lot of detailed negotiation, including helped by the Americans, of course, CENTCOM, but also the Israeli Defense Forces, to resolve those worries. And that enabled us to move forward as a humanitarian partner for that operation.
Great. I think we have to do a last question. I think Isan, you had your hand up earlier, but only if it's a hopeful question. Okay. All right. Maggie, is it going to be hopeful?
Mr. Griffiths, it's Margaret Bashir, VOA. I hope you get some sleep, because I imagine in your job it's mostly sleepless nights. So could you just go back to you were speaking about this aid convoy that the trucks were stolen. I'm not seeing anything really online about it. Could you just give us some more details about how many trucks were taken? Did they just drive off with them? What happened to the drivers? Any details you could give us? You said this was Saturday, I believe.
Yeah.
And then just if you could just wrap up with Sudan, is anything getting through to Darfur? The two crossings in Chad have reopened? Is anything able to get through, or is there too much fighting?
Sorry, yes. I'm just checking my notes here of what happened on that Saturday, and I think what happened was that there was a convoy of 61 trucks. 52 were looted, and 9 partially so. And in fact, only 34 trucks were recovered. So it was a really important moment. Really,
What about the drivers? What did they say?
I don't know. This is the World Food Programme letting me know that this was a really bad day for the people of Gaza. We recorded no fatalities on that occasion, but it was a brutal reminder of going back to the question about what do we need. Well, we need to have security, We need that not to happen. And, one of the ways in which that's going to stop happening is by flooding Gaza with aid so that people don't have to resort to criminal enterprise to feed their families. As I said, I don't find it surprising that they would, but we need to flood that place with aid, and many people have said that, certainly before me. On the second point, which was Sudan, very little getting into Darfur, but some. And again, there have been some very useful discussions, both in Port Sudan, but also in Nairobi and elsewhere, about the need for cross-border. There is some stuff coming in from Tina, from Chad, as you know. Mr. Lamamra met with the leaders of the Sudanese authorities in Port Sudan. He also met with representatives of the RSF later in Nairobi. We've been working very hard, including myself, in developing a plan to save al-Fasher. 800,000 civilians at risk, God knows it deserves a plan. And essentially, it is based on the notion of the two warring parties agreeing not to attack each other in al-Fasher, and that the al-Fasher itself could be, as it were, secured by, as it was last year, by joint forces and elders, which kept al-Fasher safe during some of the months of 2023. Now, we're getting nowhere on that plan at the moment. It's something, however, that Ramtane Lamamra very much has in mind, and he thinks it's also important not just to focus on al-Fasher, but maybe to look at other places where this kind of détente, or not détente, but temporary ceasefire or pause or whatever, could benefit, maybe with the roles different in different places. I think it's a real test to see if his diplomacy or our diplomacy will actually bear results. And what it requires, of course, is not just the United Nations personal envoy or our humanitarian coordinator doing it, but those member states who have leverage and power and influence and authority over people who can make the right decision. This is the time to step up. It's a bleak season in Sudan. It's a bleak season.
All right, thank you so much.
On a high note.
I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I hope, Mr. Griffiths, you can come back in a different
Can you take a
capacity.
question online, please? One question online.
Oh, do you have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay. Sorry, I can't see.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much.
Abdelhamid, all right.
Are you giving me the right to
Go ahead, Abdelhamid.
a question, right?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Abdelhamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. Thank you, Mr. Griffith, for this important briefing. We wish you the best of luck. I really commend you for your courage and your speaking truth to power, not like many other senior officials who buried their heads in the sand as if nothing happened in Gaza. Sir, tomorrow, June 5, is the 57th anniversary of the occupation of Israel of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, as you know. 57 years of occupation, the Palestinians saw their land being confiscated, settlements are being erected every part.
I'm sorry, Abdelhamid, sorry. We have to get Mr. Griffiths out, so if you could just ask your question.
Okay, my question is 57 years. What do you advise the Palestinians to do when they are facing a country, a member state that defying every international law, every humanitarian law? What the Palestinian can do? Thank you.
Well, as you know, Abdul, I am a humanitarian official, and my role is to try to make sure that people who need humanitarian aid get it. And we've had lots of details about what that means in the context of Gaza, but also the West Bank. So that's very clear. It's also very clear, however, I as a UN official obviously subscribe to the notion that it's essential to have a clear roadmap to a two-state solution, to statehood, eventually for the Palestinian people. It's not my portfolio, but it has a bearing on mine because I know from the work that I'm involved in, but also the work that I have been involved in the past as a mediator, is that as much as anything else, people need hope. if they are to survive, if they are to be resilient, they need hope. And as I've referred today to the horizon of hope that's needed for the people of Gaza, and it's needed for the people of Palestine, that's why that discussion that you were asking questions about the future and future arrangements, is so vitally important. It's so important for the welfare of people today that they know what may happen tomorrow. The failure of hope for those so serially displaced in Gaza has been a terrible, terrible sight and a stain, as you know, on our common humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. No, I drank enough of it. Thanks a lot. Thank you.